I'll tell you a story about that. It's a personal story. And Tammy's told it before, so I know I can tell it. When both of us were very ill over the last 3 or 4 years, my wife almost died, and so did I. And all that unfolded over a period that lasted a few years. And we were apart for a lot of that. And when we came back together, we were quite distant from one another, partly because, well, I was still quite ill and Tammy was still recovering. And, well, many things had happened in the interim, to say the least. And it wasn't a straightforward thing for us to put ourselves back together as a couple. The will was there. We had a practice of consciously dating for decades. So when we first had little kids, and this happens to people who have little kids, we found that we were separating intimately. And that's because when you're at that stage of your life and you're developing your career and you have little kids, it's like sex is priority number 11 on a priority list of 10, and you only ever get to priority 5. And so it's not that it's unimportant, it's that it becomes displaced. And that's understandable, but it's not a good medium to long-term solution. It has to be moved back up the priority list to some minimally acceptable degree. And the question is that you have to negotiate as a couple is, what is that minimally acceptable degree? And people hate having that conversation because people will act out sexual acts, say that they'll never talk about, which is a strange reality. When I was working as a clinician, I used to have these conversations with my clients, especially now and then. I would have both my client and their husband or wife in the office with me to talk over issues like this. And one of the things I would ask them, which they absolutely hated, was, well, how often should you have sex? And they would come up with all sorts of reasons to not give an answer to that question, like, well, we don't want to make it so formal, and we don't really want to, we don't want to take the spontaneity out of it. And it's like, yeah, really, you're having a lot of spontaneous sex, are you really? That's actually, you've been married 10 years, 15 years. There's so much spontaneous sex that you just don't want to mess with that. It's like, why are you in my office? So that's just delusional. And so, but it was still very difficult to pin either of them down. And I suppose that's because, you know, maybe the husband says, well, 15 times a week, and the wife says once every 2 years. And that's, and neither of them want to admit that that's what they want or need, and so they won't talk about it. And so you have to corner people if you're a treacherous therapist. And the way you do that is by starting with something absurd. It's like, well, how about once every 2 years? And both of them pretty much agree almost instantly that that's probably a little on the scarce side. And then you might say, well, how about 4 times a day? And virtually without exception, although not always, both parties agree that that's probably aiming for the stars, let's say. But then now you've got people nicely trapped, because you know it's somewhere between 4 times a day and once every 2 years. And then you can pull in the walls. It's like, well, how about 6 times a week? Or how about once every 3 months? And, you know, that's a lot closer, right? It's still not that close, but it's a lot closer. And generally, my experience was that people who have relatively productive and engaged and multidimensional lives settle on something varying between 1 to 3 times a week. And that's a close approximation. And I've also noticed that couples who aren't intimate physically, about once a week at minimum, things tend to deteriorate across time, and the relationship tends not to hold. And I've also noticed that unless you spend about 90 minutes a week listening to and talking to your partner about practical matters of the domestic economy and your shared life, you also build up a huge backlog of undisclosed communication, and 10 years from now that will fall on you in the form of a divorce case, and you'll spend all the time you could have been talking at home talking in court, which I wouldn't recommend. And I also think it's very difficult to get that 90 minutes or 120 minutes or whatever it happens to be a week of intimate time together unless you first sort out the 90 minutes or 120 minutes of necessary communication. But it's worth the discussion.